amending our soil, caring for our water systems, caring for our forest systems, caring for our marine systems, and everything in between. And of course, our keiki and our kupuna. So thank you for that. So today, just wanted to give a quick overview of what we're discussing and the actual purpose of today. So today is a kickoff of sorts leading into our 2.5-day summit, which is taking place at December 14th and December 15th at West Oʻahu. This year, we're also going to, based on your folks' feedback at last year's summit and then some other lists, we are going to also add a pre-summit gathering at Kawaiwai Mo'iliili on University Ave. And we'll talk more about that, the purpose of that. So leading into our 2-day summit, we really want to gather as much feedback and input, and we want to learn together. We want to make sure that there is some of a base level of understanding so that as we go into our 2-day summit, we have equitable access to the information and tools that are available to this particular community. So as we have conversations around what are going to be some policy priorities that we all agree to advancing, we can make sure that we have the information that is needed to have thorough, robust conversation, to have good dialogue and exchange, to ask ourselves, what don't we know? Who else needs to be at the table? What are we missing? Where might be our blind spots? So that by the time that we do convene, day one of the actual summit, we will have a good set of policy priorities, policy areas for which this community is interested in advancing, okay? To do that, and then to do the work past the summit, the second annual summit, we have been discussing loosely, informally, and trying to formalize a network of sorts, a council of sorts, a hui, a working group that is going to help then pull together all of the folks that are actors, advocates, educators that make up this ecosystem, that make up this particular community as it relates to policy initiatives and advocacy. How are we going to convene? When are we going to convene? Are we going to do this annually? Who's going to call for the agenda? Who gets to represent? Whose voices are represented in this working group? How does this community want to make decisions going forward? And then how do we share responsibility? As we know, we're all doing a lot. And so how do we share in the work and in the responsibility in a way that is productive, and in a way that is also mindful of everyone's current loads of responsibility. So today is mostly focused on learning about 2 areas. One is food system governance in Hawaii. We're so thankful that Nani Conklin, she's a native daughter of Maui, who has conducted tremendous research in this area, and she'll be providing information to us, followed by Paula Daniels, whom we know, who is also well known for her decades of work establishing county level LA county policy and creating policy councils that have effectuated some of their great work in LA County. So, and then we'll wrap it up with some guiding questions. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that you had at the top, you folks all have announcements as well. So a couple of announcements. Oʻahu Good Food Show, that's actually tomorrow, in the Google Doc that's been presented to all of you, shared with all of you. There is a link. If you are able to participate, you can register for tomorrow between 9 and 12 p.m. Is that correct, Roella? 9 and 12 p.m. at Hawaiʻi Convention Center. We also want to you know that in the chat, and maybe we can provide it in the chat again, the registration for the summit, the 2-day summit, and the pre-summit activities. And finally, we also have Albi. So next week we have another event taking place at Kauai. Would you mind unmuting yourself and sharing with the group time and place and topic?
Sure, I'll drop that into the chat, but it's coming up on, I believe it is the 18th, but I'll drop it into the chat.
Wonderful. And if any of you have announcements that you'd like to share with this community, please go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure that we also post it in these notes as well. Okay. So at this time, I'd like to thank Nani Conklin for joining us today. She's a graduate of, recent graduate of Berkeley, and conducted her thesis, her master's thesis on food system governance in Hawaii. She's been a tremendous resource to us at Transforming Hawaii's Food Systems Together, and we're so thankful that she's here. She is been working hard for all of the Maui recovery efforts as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Nani, and after she shares some of the highlights, salient points of her research, we will have time for discussion, Q&A as well. Thank you.
Aloha mai kako. Let me just get my screen sharing up here. And big mahalo to Mahina, to the whole Transforming Hawaii's Food System group for including me here. All right. So my name is Nani, and I got my start in public health and food systems while supporting people experiencing houselessness and food insecurity, primarily on Oahu, but like Mahina said, I'm also originally from Maui, so my focus has been here in the last few years. And that's really what spurred me to study food system planning during my Master of Public Health program, and then partner with this hui on a national analysis of food system planning. Our goal was really to understand the enabling conditions of food system plans and learn from the successes and challenges of other municipalities who had created these plans. So this analysis generated several different work products, including a food system planning toolkit and a database of policy recommendations that I'll link to on my last slide. But today I'll be sharing our analysis of good food governance, a written version of which will be included in the integrated food system policy framework that Transforming Hawaii's Food System Together will publish at the end of the year. My slides are really meant to give more context to the topic of food systems governance and kick off your discussion. So they're not meant to be prescriptive or suggest that there's a specific idea of what governance should look like that this group is putting forth. I know we usually give acknowledgements at the end of a presentation, but I want to first recognize the people who have made this work possible and clarify the perspectives, training, and positionality that shaped our analysis. So my collaborators were Rose Benjamin and Ella Geismar, who studied public policy at UC Berkeley, and Paula Daniels, the wonderful founder of the Center for Good Food Purchasing and one of the founders of the LA Food Policy Council, where the idea of good food governance originated. Much of this work was funded by Transforming Hawaii's Food System Together via a grant from the Kellogg Foundation secured by Dr. Albie Miles. I know you're pretty familiar with food systems, but just to give a working definition for our research, we define them as the interconnected actors, processes, and policies that influence agriculture, markets, land access, and really everything related to food. Ideally, food systems would support public health among many other domains. And as diverse actors consider how to achieve more ideal food systems, governance, or the interactions between public and private entities aimed at the realization of collective goals, is increasingly recognized as an important driver of change. As I'll discuss in just a minute, an expansive understanding of governance is necessary to hold. Oh, maybe everyone could mute. I'm not sure if you can hear the echo. Okay, but an expansive understanding of governance is necessary to hold the complexity of the food system. Food systems issues are often addressed through an isolated sectoral lens, largely due to mid-20th century and Western approaches to food and agriculture. that lead actors to intervene at the production or consumption levels and not consider their inherently systemic and interrelated relationships. Now, in Hawaii specifically, the governance of food systems is inextricably intertwined with larger histories of colonialism, commodification, dispossession, and the disenfranchisement of Native Hawaiians. As in most places, there's no single government agency, task force, or community group that governs food as a holistic system. Instead, there are many actors who have varying degrees of legal jurisdiction and influence along the value chain. And as I'm sure you've experienced, folks may communicate with each other or partner on critical initiatives like community food distribution, but they may also duplicate each other's work or have conflicts of interest and competing priorities. Existing partnerships, while having some success, are often limited in their reach, authority, and funding, which reduces their ability to address these deep-seated systemic issues. Private corporations, large-scale landowners, hotels, and the US military exert an outsized influence on access to critical resources like irrigation, fishing sites, and agricultural land. So this consolidation of power, along with the state government's mixed record on agricultural management, really complicates the relationships between food system actors and undermines trust in the ability of conventional systems of governance to truly transform Hawaii's food system. So in order to support this food system planning process, our team wanted to know, within the United States, how have other regions approached food system governance? What are the enabling conditions of effective food system governance in Hawaii, and what are the potential barriers? And then how might we measure progress towards good food governance in Hawaii? Our methods included a literature review of food systems planning more broadly, and the history of Hawaii's food system and politics, just some light reading during a master's program, a thematic analysis of 25 food system plans from US cities, counties, states, and regions, and interviews with food system planners, food policy councils, and government staff across the US. For the purposes of this research, we defined a food system plan as an integrated set of policy recommendations or action steps intended to support the health and resilience of every component of the food system. Now, these plans are often written by food policy councils or similar types of groups that include representatives from across different sectors. We saw that anti-hunger groups often initiated or led the work, since they were frequently some of the most established and well-connected groups in the municipalities we studied. Our analysis highlighted the importance of novel governance structures, deeper and wider collaborations, and participatory processes in both planning and implementing food system transformation. Thematic analysis of all the plan's policy recommendations found that every plan explicitly mentioned governance, and over 40% of the more than 400 recommendations we reviewed pertain to governance. LA's plan, which Paula Daniels can speak to after this, conceived of the term good food governance, which centers on the meaningful inclusion of relevant stakeholders from different sectors, as well as structures that allow for their coherence and coordination. And folded into their model is the idea of food democracy, or the practice of citizens reclaiming control of their food systems. Now, this led me to dive back into the literature on food systems governance to understand, how are people actually structuring these governing bodies? What characteristics do they need to have in order to support public engagement and real change in food systems? To share a very quick synthesis of what I found, there were several weaknesses that academics and practitioners alike identified with current governance structures, including limited involvement of civil society in developing food policy, power asymmetries, lack of coordination and regulation of large corporations, lack of transparency and accountability, and fragmented food policies that focused on stopgap measures rather than holistic solutions. I'm sure none of that is new to you folks. And it really speaks to food systems problems as what they call wicked problems, right? Ones that are hard to define, ambiguous, often contested, and subject to many layers of complexity and interdependence. There are several characteristics, though, of effective governance in the face of wicked problems that kept coming up in my research. They were reflexivity, or the capability to understand and handle the variety of frames surrounding a policy problem. So in other words, how does the governance system respond when people disagree about what the problems are and what the solutions should be? Is there space built into this governance system to discuss diverging views and determine common objectives? Another characteristic was resilience, the ability to adapt flexibly to uncertainties and constantly changing conditions. So can the system identify, tolerate, and adapt to these changing circumstances? Or is it so rigid that it's not able to be? Responsiveness was another one, being able to observe and respond effectively, and importantly, in a timely fashion to issues that are pressing in politics and society. So can stakeholders from different backgrounds approach the governance system with demands and concerns? Are stakeholders from these different backgrounds represented within the governance system? And can the system draw from stakeholders' knowledge and expertise as needed? Another one was revitalization. I thought this was really interesting because it speaks to some of the gridlock that we've seen in governance around food systems. So are you able to unblock unproductive patterns? Do decisions require the agreement of a large number of disparate stakeholders to get any progress, even on a small issue? Are there policy processes or agreed upon structures designed to facilitate compromise? I think this is also a really interesting area to think about. What does democratic participation in a food system look like? How do we bring in some of our traditional methods of resolving conflict or reaching consensus? And then lastly, this idea of scale. Can your governance system address cross-scale interactions? Things like issues that play out differently across different places, right? We know that there are such distinct differences between agriculture and food system issues on our islands, but can the governance structure that we have really respond appropriately to those different issues? And then also issues across time. Sometimes things in the short term seem to involve trade-offs with the long term, like a policy that may negatively affect producers' bottom line today while improving long-term resource management. So is your structure able to actually respond to these and balance these trade-offs, bring in the appropriate stakeholders to speak to them? Now, based on this research and conversations with stakeholders across Hawaiʻi, our team developed the following food systems governance policy recommendations. And this is what is published in the integrated food systems framework that we'll be sharing. So we wanted to be very agnostic about what the structure itself would look like while putting forth some suggestions on what the structure would be able to do. So things like being inclusive, representing the full spectrum of stakeholders within the food system, potentially incorporating a collective impact framework, which I'll speak to in just a minute. And then making sure that there's some sort of coordinating body, but also a coordination as a key goal. One thing that we saw in our interviews with food system planners across the US was that the process of bringing people together to deliberate what policies do we need, what are the issues our communities are facing, that really generated actually a lot of new connections between organizations, new coalitions and working groups. Then in addition to forming this, fancy plan, these connections and networks were also what drove solutions forward. And so we wanted to center that connectivity and coordination, and then also identify some sort of permanent, long-lasting food system governance structure, whether it looks like a food policy council, a coalition, a community-led coalition, holistic coalition. There's all sorts of different terms out there. And that's really what you'll be able to discuss of what feels most representative and most effective. And then you'll see, and I can share these slides later too, that we suggested using frameworks such as equity-centered design. So really bringing in individual stakeholders, finding ways to incorporate community needs and voices into the governance structure. And then network building, thinking about how can we improve collaboration and really have these kind of synergies that build on each other. There are so many people doing so much good work across our islands. Are there ways that we can pull together and amplify what the other groups are doing? We also developed possible indicators of progress towards good food governance in Hawaii. That we firmly believe that the governing body, community members, and everyone who's involved in this structure should identify a shared measurement system and indicators of success. We think that really plays into accountability. And one thing we notice across plans is that sometimes people have great ideas, they implement maybe some of them, but then they don't go back and evaluate and see what worked. What can we keep on doing? Is this worth the funding? Is there another way that we should be approaching this issue? I want to focus before I end now on some of the models of governance that we came across. And this is that collective impact framework. While there's limited research and evaluation of food system governance models, collective impact did emerge as a popular framework since it recognizes that large-scale social change comes from better cross-sector coordination and avoids that top-down approach. I really appreciate this graphic because it shows both some of the key elements of a successful collective impact initiative, and it also shows what are some of the dangers, what are we running into in existing coalitions and existing ways that we're approaching food policy. I really want to call attention to, in that collaboration section, that idea of only including the usual suspects. And we want to think about how can we include those unusual suspects, those voices who have not maybe been centered in decision-making, but who we all know within our community and whose expertise is really important. And this graphic on the right then shows what are the key elements, right? A backbone coordinating organization, a common agenda for change, that idea of shared measurement, and then they mentioned continuous and open communication, which I think speaks to that idea of food democracy that Paula will get to as well. And I wanted to end by talking about this idea of networks. And this was new to me, but the idea of network weaving. And this is separate from the idea of kind of a coalition, which a lot of us think of as still a fairly inclusive group, but thinking of networks as a little more disparate, of bringing together those unusual suspects, but also not having the same kind of structured boundary or structured set of who's doing what. And so there's a lot of focus on working groups and working together to identify needs, then from that identified need, forming a working group and then supporting that group. So again, this is just, stretching the surface of some of these different governance structures and approaches, but I wanted to give us some shared language too. And then end by talking about what some of those structures are. I don't think my slide is coming up here. But some of the structures that have been proposed and that we came across were those food policy councils, right? And while that term is used by a lot of people, I think what they look like is very different. Some are really networks who are bringing together different groups. They may not have the same kind of shared agenda and common objectives, but they're very responsive to community issues. And some more really are those councils who are bringing in set organizations. They have established objectives and timelines, and they're communicating up the issues that are coming up within community. And so I think there's so much more that we could say about this. And certainly I have a big digital stack of research papers on this that I'd be happy to share. But I really want to turn it over to you to hear what are some of your initial thoughts on food system governance, on what is needed in Hawaii, and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Nani. Appreciate how you're able to share a big overview of what you've studied and what you've researched, and kind of distilled it down to into bite-sized pieces where we can all digest pretty easily. So thank you so much for that. Before we turn it over back to all of you to ask ask questions, to react to what you heard, just two things. In the shared agenda and working notes agenda, you will see that we've used a particular term, Food Policy Council, as a proxy. It's really just placeholder, because honestly, I'm not sure what we as community want to call what we are trying to build together. So I just use that just as a placeholder name. Please, I apologize if I have confused anyone, or please know that there's no assumptions or implications that or inferences that we are leading towards a particular structure. That is not the case. It's just really a placeholder name. And then the second thing is, I want to invite everyone to have just like, let's have exchange and conversation around the information that we heard. Let's ask clarifying questions. Let's float ideas. I do want us to spend a little bit of conversation around designing out the structure, because we also have another presentation by Paula. So this is really about, let's gather all the information together. Let's hear the information together. Let's digest the information together. Once we've level setted with a base level of information, then let's ask ourselves all those questions, or what are we going to formulate, to what ends, and how are we going to proceed and make decisions and structure it in a way where it's transparent, it's equitable, and all the things that are important to us. Okay, so with that, let's open up the room for discussion for up to 10 minutes. So go ahead and just either unmute yourself or raise your hand or your virtual hand. Yes, Don, thank you.
Mahalo for all your work and all the input in the presentation we just heard. Many times, I think we need to realize that we need to go back to the future. The food system that fed probably about 150,000 people here on Kauai existed until the day Captain Cook arrived. That food system was basically community-based. The thing that you just talked about is called the Watershed Council, or the AHA Council. That's people, that community-driven and driven by the watershed community. It was invented here. It was destroyed by the Big Five. Who would ever want the community making decisions? Heaven forbid. Ironically, Oregon State adopted it into state law in 1993. They have 350 watershed councils. Their budget, the Hawaii budget for watershed protection, which is DLNR's #1 priority, is $1 million. Oregon has $150 million earmarked every year for those watershed councils. I'm glad you showed the slide of the illegal overthrow of Liliuokalani. Really, all the things we're talking about probably won't be resolved until Keanu Sai and his group win the lawsuit, the Hawaiian Kingdom versus Joe Biden. Until we do that, we're constantly battling the challenge between two communities. The Hawaiian community that cares about the land, loves the land, shares aloha, lives aloha. I have 13 taro lo'i, 30 water buffalo. I mean, it's abundant food I have. But you also ran into things like the Hawaii Important Agricultural Lands designation that took place a few years ago, and I was picked as a technical advisor on that. The whole thing was a shibai, was a scam. We could not use, because the legislature said we couldn't use agricultural lands to identify unless they were in production today. But when Captain Cook arrived on Kauai, there were 38,000 acres of taro lo'i. Today we have 140. That's less than 0.5%. That food fed almost 150,000 people. Today we only have about 70,000. We import 90% of our food. Plus our coral reefs are dying because those constructed wetlands, those taro lo'i, functioned as the kidneys of the watershed. They trap sediment. I'm sorry.
Don, thank you so much. Please, maybe 1 more minute to share your thoughts.
I thought you said 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
No, we're all on board with what you're sharing.
Okay.
AO to that, 100%.
Yeah, well, I think that the integrated food system policy, we already know what it is. We need to go back to the future, reinstate the watershed councils, reinstate the lawful Hawaiian government that's based on Hawaiian sustainable values, not greed, not sell it to the highest bidder. So until we do that, you know, I don't know how fast we'll move forward. And it's really all about water. It's not about food. It's about water. The Kauai County Council addressed that issue today. I gave testimony in there this morning. And
Thank
until
you.
we get our water back and realize it's cultural water, it doesn't belong to the big five. Anyway, enough said. Thank you, Albie, for being here. He's my hero.
Awesome. Thank you. So what I take away from your comments is that you're in agreement that a hui and advice, some type of hui, community-based hui is important. Oregon is a model for that.
No, Hawaii is a model for that. It was invented here
for 2,000 years, and it was, recently undone. And you are advocating to reinstate an indigenous system that is focused primarily on water system.
Correct. You don't need a technical advisory group. Make the watershed councils your technical advisory group.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I think any other questions? I do see a question in the chat. How were the 25 food systems defined?
So those we identified based on existing food system plans in the United States. Over 60% now of states in the US have some sort of food system plan either in place or in progress. And so we were able to connect with researchers at the University of Michigan and Michigan State University who had compiled already a list of those plans, but hadn't necessarily analyzed their content. And so that's what really led to our research and led us to be able to identify who is involved in putting those plans together and talk to them about what their experience was, how they engage stakeholders, and all of that. So it was what plans are currently in existence in the US was our starting place.
Thank you. Lenny, I had a question as well. In one of your earlier slides, I can't recall which slide, but you talked, there was a point made about this asymmetries. Can you elaborate more about that? What is that?
I think this also comes into the idea of food sovereignty, right? The idea coined by La Via Campesina of who holds power in the food system. If we're going to have food justice, what needs to occur? And I think a lot of folks are realizing that there needs to be a restructuring and rebalance of power. And so there are all sorts of different types of power, right? Who has information about something, who has jurisdiction over something, the list goes on. And so thinking about where are there power imbalances within our food system, and in what ways can governance not only, make that a little bit better right now, but how can we build out a governance system that redistributes power in spite of maybe not having some of the overall governance systems that we might want in our islands.
Mahalo nui. Are there any other questions that folks if you have questions that you want to clarify, there's a point of interest that you really want to learn more about? I see a question or a comment from Hunter as well. Would add that networks do not necessarily have blurry membership boundaries or loose focus. Ideally, participants define membership and purpose during formation. Yes. Another comment from Amber, you folks can read it also in chat, but for those who are toggling between devices, your code book was very interesting, that good food governance was of high priority, but much less for equity and justice and food sovereignty. You want to respond to that, Nani?
I do, because that was something we noticed as well. We were a little disappointed to see that. I appreciate that people may not have been able to put in those words some of the same principles that I think we hold around food systems, but there was such an emphasis on who is doing what, and starting from that formal governance structure, which can be helpful, right? I'm sure Paula can speak to when you have some sort of tie to governance, you have funding behind you, you have legitimacy, you have some of that actual ability to compel action. And that's very different from a group that is totally outside government and doesn't have some of those same capabilities. Now, that being said, I think that we really need to be building equity and justice and food sovereignty into all of our policy recommendations. That's just my personal view, but I think one that's shared. And in some of the food system plans that were put together by groups inherently or kind of specifically organized around equity, we really saw that almost every one of their recommendations for policy could be tagged with that kind of equity. Like you said, the code book. And so that was encouraging to see, but I think it also shows that we need to center, if we value equity and food justice, we need to center that from the beginning and have that inform how we're building the governance structure. And then that in turn informs our policy recommendations.
Thank you, Nani. I encourage you to place your email into the chat. And then as we do that, so folks, if you have any other questions, we will share the recording. So you'll have Nani's presentation as well for our reference. But this time, thank you again, Nani, for making time for us and the good research that you've conducted. At this time, I want to welcome back to the conversation, dear friend, Paula Daniels. We know her, we applaud her work. And we love when you're home. So get back home already, Paula. and we've asked Paula to share, lessons from the field. She has worked with a number of counties, LA County being I believe one of the largest largest districts, single districts, for which she enacted change through a multi-step process. So Paula, would love for you to share lessons from the field and specifically around, what are some of the shapes, food governance shapes that you have seen, working models that you have seen that produce transformative results that are more in alignment with what Hawaii, this particular community, is aspiring to, and maybe even like what not to do. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some examples, that would be a great way to utilize some of our time today. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, mahalo mahina. It's good to see you all, and it's I really appreciate being part of the conversation with everybody. So many of you who I know, and I thought Nani did an excellent job. That was a really good job of presenting the report and the work in the report. And I just want to share that in the course of doing the work with Nani and the rest of the team, Nani and I learned that we're actually related. So we're distant cousins. The Daniel side, my family is from Maui. And so my great-great-grandfather, William Henry Daniels, was the brother to her great-great-great-grandmother, Emma. So we go way back on Maui, going back to we're Kanaka Maoli, so on that side. So it's fun to be in this work with her together at this time too. It feels like things coming full circle because our family was very involved in a lot of agricultural work in Hawaii. My great-great-grandfather owned a taro company a long time ago, and actually owned Kaho'olawe for a while until they realized there was actually no water there. So they were trying to do stuff with it. All right. So more to the point, I'm glad we have this conversation because governance around food policy, governance in general, is best when it's inclusive governance. And in many areas there, we've already delegated areas of management in the public interest to government, like our energy systems and our water systems, our utility systems are managed by government. And whether or not those decision-making structures are participatory is a matter of discussion for sure. But the food system for too long has been a privatized system. As one of the speakers pointed out, it was different before Western contact, but it's a privatized system. So food policy councils started showing up in the 1990s in North America, around the same time that the notion of agroecology was starting to be developed in South America, and which led to the Campesino movement and others type movements in South America, and in large part as a response to private management of the food system as a countervailing force and a need to bring siloed thinking together. So inclusive governance can happen in a number of ways. It doesn't necessarily have to happen through food policy councils as a formal structure, but it certainly was something that was of moment in the 1990s and has gained momentum since then, because there's quite a few around the world. And I was privileged to be able to lead the creation of the LA Food Policy Council, actually for LA City. So LA City has got a weird design. It's a city, separate county, but it was for LA City. And now LA County has started to put together food policy. They call it the Food Equity Roundtable. So I can talk about that a little bit. I have, like a lot of detail I can go into with the LA Food Policy Council, but I want to give you examples from around the world and in the country. So I'm going to show you a report that has international examples and pull out one from another country. I'll talk a little bit about the LA Food Policy Council, point you to a resource from that harnesses information from all the food policy councils in existence now. When I started the LA Food Policy Council, I think there were just a handful of food policy councils. The work started in 2009 in the United States, and now there's hundreds of them. So there's a Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future is gathering that information and doing reports on it. So I'll point you to that resource. And then I want to give you an example of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. And if I'm not taking up too much time, I'll leave you with a takeaway and a recommendation. So let me, I'm going to switch back and forth between slides and sharing my screen of a website. So here is a report that is really useful, and it's a good thing to have in your back pocket. It's a report by One Planet that was done in partnership. It's a World Wildlife Fund initiative that was done in partnership with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And they feel like these inclusive governance processes, what they call multi-stakeholder mechanisms, were so important. They did a report on it that was published in 2021. And looked at a number of what they call multi-stakeholder mechanisms. They weren't because what they looked at weren't all food policy councils, but the idea is some sort of inclusive, participatory approach to dealing with food systems. And they arrived at 10 cases that they thought were the best examples. And I will share with you now that we were very pleased to see that the LA Food Policy Council was counted as one of them. But what I'll show you right now, the reason I have this screen up is because I want to give you the example. If you click, to the example of the 10 examples they pulled out. So I want to talk to you a little bit about France. So France has a national food council. So this is what I'm going to give you are some very different examples. France, entirely government designed. LA, government led, but inclusive of all aspects, including business and nonprofit organizations. And then the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, which is entirely bottom-up, grassroots, and NGO based. But they work a lot with government. So this is an example of an entirely government driven food policy council. They created it by mandate, by law. Its role is to be an advisory body for food related issues in France. They established process of consultations, a very formal system. And they have, looks like they have appointed government members, and they're grouped into different categories. So this is the most formal of them all. But I will say they have been able to do from what I gather, a very inclusive public decision-making process related to all these issues that you can see right here. And some good things have come out of it. So I think it's worth looking at because they've really managed to establish a lot. They created a law called the Egalim Law. And in the Egalim Law, they have required that 50% of their objective is that 50% of food served in what they call their collective catering organizations, meaning food service, like schools and other hospitals and so forth, 50% must be what they call quality products, and they define quality products. And then they require that 20% be from organic farming. And then this is true also for meat and fish. They have a 60% goal. And they have been moving along on this and have also established a data collection process where they have all the different, again, they call them their canteens, collective catering, school food cafeterias, hospital cafeterias, and food service is how we would understand it. And they have their different canteens report how they're doing. This particular canteen, it's a small one. They only serve 50 meals a day, but they're reporting in on how they're doing for this law. So 92% organic, 7% quality. They also have a local requirement somewhere. So they have 2,000 organizations that have already reported into this. So I would call that a pretty successful outcome is it's just one method, right, of managing how to do that inclusive governance. You'd have to take a look at the report and look at it more deeply to see what you see about what they've unearthed about how that works. So the other method, and again, they pointed out the LA Food Policy Council is ours. So I'll just take a couple minutes to talk about that and what I did there. I just did this lecture for a class I'm teaching. I just came from the class. I'm teaching class at UCLA Law School called Food as Commons or Commodity, the case for agroecology. So a lot of what we talked about was inclusive governance mechanisms. So I'm not going to go through all of these slides here, but I will show you the page where we were highlighted in that same report, which I showed to you, and they talk about the creation of the LA Food Policy Council. It's interesting for me to, talk about what they found based on what I did, but I will share this with you. At the time that I created the LA Food Policy Council, what I was looking at was a way to, I was in government and was, convinced the mayor that we should pursue this initiative. And I was looking at a way to make sure we had full stakeholder participation. And what I saw by contrast was that in San Francisco, they had followed basically the French model, but the French model worked out differently. And these all happened in earlier periods of time. But in 2009, Gavin Newsom was the mayor of San Francisco, and he created a food policy council by executive order and decreed that all the heads of departments should be part of this food policy council and that they should include stakeholders. I saw that. I thought that could be a way that we could go in Los Angeles, but I chose not to because my concern with that was that it might disappear when Gavin Newsom left office, which he was going to do, I think, in a few years. Could everybody mute? Somebody's got their, and I can hear background noise. So if you could, I think I know who it is, but anyway, I won't say anymore. Okay. So that in fact happened. I mean, at the time I was looking at creating Food Policy Council for LA, I didn't know what the outcome would be, but I suspected it might. As it turned out, it might. That once Gavin Newsom left office, the Food Policy Council disbanded. What I was also concerned about was that it was run by a department, the Department of Public Health, and I was concerned about how they would manage public input, that it might be pro forma, that they might just, have people there and listen, smile and nod, and then, are they really taking their work into account? Is it more that the people from the sort of so-called public stakeholder groups were just kind of listening in and providing guidance, or were they actually helping to make decisions and co-create? So I think they did a good job. I'm not saying they didn't, but I was concerned about that being an issue. By contrast, at the time we're putting the Food Policy Council together, Oakland was putting Food Policy Council together as well, and it was a completely open process. They just took applications in and they didn't sift through for expertise or true stakeholder representation. So what I was worried about is that would just take a long time to get to a point where you could start making decisions. And I felt in our instance that we wanted to get stuff done pretty quickly. So wanted to manage it differently. As it turns out, again, fast forward years later, looking back, Oakland took a long time to get organized because they didn't have a clear vision as to who the stakeholders would be at the table. We had a vision, like those of us who were on the task force with LA wanted to have a specific representation throughout across the food system spectrum so that we'd make sure that all voices were heard. So we want to have farmers, but we want to have folks along the supply chain. We want to have the businesses involved. We knew that labor was important, so we included labor. We included the health departments, and we included all the advocacy groups that were interested. But we also didn't want an imbalance, because if there just so happened to be a lot of advocacy groups and focused on food access, that could be more voices in the room than there were farmers. So we needed farmers to feel like they weren't being outnumbered. So we made sure that there was a balance for all the issue areas that were defined, and we did it by agreement, on who should be in the room. So that was important, and that became our model. One thing I want to say about this is that I'm going to sort of jump ahead here. This is more detail than you need right now. If somebody wants this detail, I can provide it to you another time. But this is sort of how we structured our process. and got to decision making in a short amount of time, because we had wanted to get this done where we had a plan in 9 months, and we did. But what I want to share with you is it took some time, to get to this point. It took from, starting the concept about it in the spring of 2009 to actually starting task force meetings in the fall of 2009 to coming up with a report saying there should be a food policy council in 2010. And then from 2010, presenting a report and then taking some time to think about the structure and the decision-making process and who should be on the food policy council. And then we finally opened our doors in 2011. And I see a typo there I'm going to get rid of. So that careful process of thinking through the structure, the goals, the decision-making, I think was helpful, because by the time we started, we actually hit the ground running. And from 2011 to 2012, we accomplished some things. We got some stuff done. We created the Good Food Purchasing Program. We did a number of other things. So I'm going to pop out of these slides right now and move on to showing you. I'll leave the rest for conversation or questions, if there's any questions about detail. But I now want to show you the resource from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. This is the Johns Hopkins Food Policy Network. So they are collecting a lot of information on food policy networks across the country and how they work. And they've done a lot of study on this, and they have some examples here about how they got their work done, either through partnerships, through program development. And you don't see the LA Food Policy Council here, but we're one of them. And then through policy. So there's a lot of good resources if you want to do more research and thinking about it as you move along through this process there. So now I want to show you the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, which in my view, some of you know my work. We work around the country, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and we work with a lot of food policy councils. So we work in partnership with nonprofit organizations and institutions in each of these regions, and only go in by invitation. So we do work with a lot of food policy action councils. And of all the ones we're working with across the country, I'm most impressed with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, which started in 2002. And if you have a chance to take a look at their website, I won't take tons of time here, but just, I can figure out how to drop these links in the chat. If that's useful to you, let me know if it is. Because I don't want to overwhelm you with info, but know that it's here. You can read about it, but it started as an outgrowth of a food summit. From what I know about them, they started just really grassroots volunteer organization, and they finally got some staff in 2017. So they're now pretty well staffed. They have, kind of a smallish board. They have a lot of accomplishments they can speak to. I know they're definitely working with our program, the Good Food Purchasing Program, and have done a lot of work around implementing it and working with government departments to do that. And even in getting to the point of having it adopted by the mayor of Chicago, the Good Food Purchasing Program, they did a lot of political work. So they're deeply engaged at every level that you can be, and to be able to accomplish their objectives. But what I want to show you is the number of staff they have. So they have an executive director. Take a look at this staff. I mean, we can count, but let's just say there's a fair amount. They've grown a lot. And the LA Food Policy Council, when I was running it, I grew it to 8 staff. We did, Nani showed you the information on collective impact. That was pretty key. We saw ourselves at the LA Food Policy Council as a backbone organization where we weren't trying to come in and take the place of other work that was going on. It was mostly to be able to coordinate it and provide whatever backbone support people needed. So we grew to the point where we were about 8 by the time I left, and then I turned the reins over to others, and they expanded and contracted according to the times. But looking at the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, you see they've got a significant size. And I also want to show you what they've done. We'll say they copied our graphic because I've got our graphic like this somewhere else, but they, I'm good with it. So they have a rhizome network. And what I want to show you in that is all the groups. It's just like their fast action group that was convened during COVID, all the different folks that are involved in their work. So it's food and ag, they've got institutions involved, they have finance institutions involved, including lenders. In the institution part, they have government, research, medical. In the food and ag part, they have producers, markets, business support. They have environmental and public health folks, and they have different community organizations that are dealing with different issues, including economic development, as well as hunger. So they've done a lot of important work, I think. It's worth taking more time to look at. So that leads me, in the interest of time, to sort of jump to my takeaway. So the takeaway is that I find it works well with most successful food policy councils. And let me pause here for a second and backtrack a little and say, I also think a really effective one is San Diego. So the San Diego Food Policy Action Council as well is very effective. And it's done a lot of good work in bringing an extremely inclusive process together, but also connects very effectively with the local government. And I don't know where their staff, they might be at 6 staff or something like that. But so my takeaway is to have a clear vision on what is intended to be accomplished if you're going to form a group to do this inclusive governance process. This sort of mirrors what Nani's already shared with you, I think, but to have a clear vision, to have it, a laser focused adherence to mission, as well as a culture of decision making that allows you to move toward strategic implementation of your mission and vision. Other key takeaway is staffing, which I think is really key, because we also had working groups. We had hundreds of people coming to our meetings. We were managing about 125 to 150 people coming to our meetings every time we had one. So we had a structure, which I will show you right now, because this leads to my other recommendation about big tents. I'm going to spend a little time talking about our structure, and then I'll leave it to question and answer. Okay, so see, I told you they copied our graphic. I had this graphic done in 2013. So this is the graphic of the LA Food Policy Council as it existed in 2013. These are all the folks that showed up to our meetings and who they represented, right? So we also had economic development, food distribution, and food hubs. We had a number of distributors in the room, in our working group structure, and also at the table for the Food Policy Council. We had folks working on good food procurement. We had labor and worker justice folks in the room, because that's extremely important to not overlook the labor component of food. I think 1 in 7 employees is in LA County is in the food system. So particularly when you think about farm workers, so that's really important. And then there were these other issue areas. We had a lot of interest in urban agriculture, and then food system and land use folks in the room, and then a lot of other issue areas. So each square represents a person or an entity or a representative of an issue area. So we had a lot of folks coming to our meetings. But so this is how our structure worked. And I deliberately created what I think of as a radiant structure versus a hierarchical structure, because this is how we worked. It wasn't hierarchical. It wasn't any one person making decisions. It was we at the center of coordinating, and we called ourselves coordinators as the staff. We were coordinating a coordinating committee, which if you had a hierarchical structure, you call it an executive committee. We had a leadership board that had that even representation that I was mentioning, 40 members, but we made sure that there was 2 from each sector or issue area, so there wasn't an imbalance. If we had a lot of people interested in urban agriculture, again, we wanted to make sure they had space. They were in the working groups, but the even representation was in the council itself. But then we had working groups, that broke into the issue areas that, this is whatever year this was, because the working groups would change depending on where the interest was. And we had more than 100 people coming to urban agriculture. We had lots of people coming to street food, not that many for sustainable seafood, but it was fine. This is how it would work. This is where everybody had a place in making a decision. So, for example, the Good Food Purchasing Program came out of one of the Good Food Economy Working Group, where we had the idea for it. It was in the policy document that we gave to the working group, but we were able to bring people into that working group that included this, the LA Unified School District, that included the distributors that distributed to LA Unified School District, that included the advocacy groups, that included, a number of folks. And we co-designed the policy that ended up becoming the Good Food Purchasing Program. So my big recommendation is a big tent, and making sure that more than, as I'm just reinforcing what Nani already said, you have more than the usual suspects in the room, but folks who care about and can help advance these issues as well. So that's my overall, experience. Thank you for asking for it. And if there's any questions, I can go more deeply into any one area or another.
Thank you so much, Paula. You and coupled with Nani's presentation gives us so much to ponder and to work with. So I'll kick us off. As I kick us off, please, if you have questions, please put them into chat. We are going to make time. So we only have 5 minutes for Q&A. We are going to make time the last 15 minutes for a breakout conversation, 2 rooms. Here's a kickoff question. So comprised in that last slide, that structure, was it really just a grassroots focus? Was the representation mostly kind of like grassroots advocates, nonprofit folks, or did you also include government officials and the private sector? And if you did, how important is it to have diverse representation and participation from state, perhaps county, perhaps private, or not? And tell us why, please.
Yeah, mahalo for that question. I really felt that it was important to have, what I meant by big tent, so I'm glad to have the chance to clarify it too, so that it was grassroots organizations and government and businesses and, every other sector was in the big tent. So even from the very beginning, from the time of the task force, we had the same, we had businesses, institutions, government representatives, and NGOs, and the like, making sure we had all that representation. I will say that was sort of the way the mayor's office worked in general. Anytime decisions were made, we always made sure we reached out to all sectors. So it wasn't, it was just a natural evolution to say, when we're going to create, food policy framework for the city, that we made sure we had that big tent. But we also asked everybody we invited in, who else do you think should be here? Who else do you think should be here? In order to make sure we're dealing with all aspects of the food system. So yes, we had government officials. We had the County Department of Public Health. We had LA Unified School District. Well, we had NGOs. We had the businesses that, distributed as well.
Thank
and
you.
I think that was important. I think we're able to get to very quick decisions that way, because when we got to the point of implementing, they were part of the process from day one. And I mean, that is important not only for, advocates, but for those who would be called upon to implement. If they're going to be called upon to implement, it's only fair that they should know what people are thinking about and and have a say in the design process before it lands on their table or their desk.
Mahalo. There's I have, a lot of different follow-up questions, because but it goes from more from the policy space to the political space, but I'll hold those questions for another time. Are there any other questions from the community here?
I see one from Jilene.
There's one in the chat, Mahina.
Thank you. I see that. Thank you.
How did we get the institutions to participate? Is that the question? Did it take policy to
Did it take force the institution to participate? to strongly suggest?
Well, I will say that I think it mattered. I think it'd be important to hear from other, maybe Roger Cooley could talk about he's the executive director of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, how he started building up. I've had lots of conversations with him. I think he was persistent and gained momentum with partnering with the labor movement in Chicago. And so when they realized how valuable it would be to have a food policy council, they joined forces and then got political. For me, when I was pulling this task force and then council together, I was a senior official already in the mayor's administration. So that was a strong convening pull. Nani mentioned that as she was going through her report. So I was able to convene. If, I contacted businesses and said, the mayor's interested in doing this, would you participate? That's helpful. So I think that helped us move a little faster because of that. It didn't mean we moved any differently. It just meant that we were able to move a little faster, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Paul. I think we have time for one more question. At least at this point, folks, if you have additional questions, go ahead and put them into chat. And this comes from Council Member Rollins Fernandez.
Yes, I see leadership. Council member, I agree with you. I think that is important, so that's a big part of making sure that how you actually manage input. I think this is something you probably have lots of familiarity with yourself is important. So leadership is a valuable part to it. And having that in your heart. Like I said, I think that was part of our administration, and I've seen that in other places. So,
and I'll just add one piece of commentary, and this also could be a benefit or a value if this community decides to evolve and progress to a shape. One of these shapes that you folks have presented on is we can build out, and this also came in we talked about this in last year's summit. To really focus on shifting the narrative. And if we are all saying individually as individuals, residents and organizations and as a collective, that centering community as a viable, as central to part of the solution making, the change that we must enact for ourselves, I think it will help to build, it'll help to see the conditions and the conversation around that shift. So thank you, everyone. What we're going to do now, we only have time. We will break out into 2 different rooms, and we're just going to do a random selection. Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you so much, Nani. And we just have time to address the first question, which is, what do we want to accomplish through this food policy, through this HUI, council, network, advisory group, working group, whatever you want to call it. What do we want to accomplish that is not yet being accomplished, that is not being now? So Abby or Roella, if you could please send us off into our breakout rooms, please join, and then we are not going to be reconvening into the whole room. Also, finally, please note that we have our next listening session is coming up, let's see, November 15th, 4 to 5:30. Thanks so everyone for joining us, and we will see you in one of the breakout rooms. Aloha.